Hi, this is Miss Dawkins, and I'm here to talk to you today about poetry programming for young adult materials. We're going to be looking at some of the resources you can use and also some ideas for programming that use poetry and allow students to show their creativity. Our learning objective for today is to come up with at least one idea that you can develop into a program that uses poetry in your library. So here we go. We're going to talk today about programming in your library, in particular how to use poetry in the program in your library. Poetry is not always the most popular thing for young adults. It has not been in the past. However, it can be a great way to reach students. Too often in the past, young adults have associated poetry with the classroom and with required reading, with Shakespeare, with Poe. But poetry can also be very interesting. One of the issues has been a lack of poetry books that have been published specifically for young adults. Of the 530 titles that were published on the Best Books for Young Adult list from 1974 to 2011, only 6 of those books were titles that were poetry titles. Most of these are the 6 that were published during that time period. And these actually are all books that are collections of poetry, and they're not books in verse. And now there are more and more novels being written in verse. One of the most popular ones here is the Cool Salsa Bilingual Poems on Growing Up Latino in the United States, a really great book. Things began to change in the 1990s. In 1986, Robert Penn Warren became America's first official poet laureate, and he began to promote poetry. And in 1996, the Academy of American Poets, the American Library Association, and others started the National Poetry Month. And National Poetry Month is now celebrated every April, which is a great opportunity to plan a lot of poetry programs in your library. Public television made poetry popular, the internet, people posting poems and sharing verses. Also, a lot of coffee houses, it became hip to go to open mic night and share your poetry. So this is really when young adult librarians began including poetry in their programming. For teens, poetry is a great choice. It allows them, as Katie Roaf has said, poetry is a perfect medium for adolescents. It lends itself to the fierce dramas and false clarities of those years. In the 1990s, there have been more and more opportunities for teens to publish online. Social media has increased the use of poetry. There are also collections of young adult written work that are now being published. And the top 10 best books for young adults, which was established in 1997, 8 out of 130 total titles have been works of poetry. The other thing that's happened is that a lot of novels now are being written in verse. More and more are. God Went to Beauty School. Keisha's House, which was written by Frost, was actually a Prince honor title, and Prince is the award for young adult literature, and it's based on literary merit. Locomotion is Jackie Woodson. Make Lemonade is actually part of a trilogy by Virginia Woolf, and her full name is Virginia Ewer Woolf. Out of the Dust is a terrific book. Street Love is Walter Dean Myers, and What is Goodbye by Nikki Grimes. Ellen Hopkins is a very popular young adult verse author. She's also very controversial, so you have to be careful about including her books in your collection, understanding who your readers are. I would not put her books in a middle school library. I would definitely have them in a high school library or a public library. She did a series of books, the Crank novels, which I can't keep on the shelf in my library. Crank is actually based on her daughter's addiction to crystal meth, so you can understand why it might be a controversial choice. There also is some strong language. There's a link here to her website if you'd like to learn more about her. Another great choice if you're wanting to add to your collection is The Watch That Ends the Night by Alan Wolfe. Alan is actually from Western North Carolina. He lives in Asheville. He is a poet. He's also written a number of books for children and young adults. He's an excellent speaker that can come to your library and speak. Most recently, about 2 years ago, he wrote The Watch That Ends the Night, Voices from the Titanic, which is, he chooses 12 characters from the Titanic and puts their story in verse. My favorite one is about the mouse, and it has the mouse's story. He likes cheese. Jacqueline Woodson was already featured earlier in my presentation, but her most recent publication, Brown Girl Dreaming, was named a National Book Award winner this past week. And she was the National Book Award winner for Young People's Literature for her book, Brown Girl Dreaming. It is an autobiographical work written in verse, and it's about growing up in New York and South Carolina in the 1960s and 1970s. It's a great book. So once you've got a great collection, or even if you don't, you can program things to celebrate poetry and creativity in your library. So April is National Poetry Month, so it's a great time to do programming that focuses around poetry. You can promote Poetry Break in libraries and classes where people come in and read poetry. You can have poems posted around the school. Voya, which is the Voice of Youth Advocates, which is the journal for the Young Adult Library Association, does Pure Poetry, which is some selections specifically for young adults. They do a poetry contest for teens. But the biggest event I always did in my library was a poetry slam. So think of it like an open mic night at a coffee house, but it's a competition, and it begins in classes. So this picture on this slide, these are the finalists from the poetry slam that I held at my school a year ago. These are the top 21 students, and the girl in the middle in the red shirt was the winner, and she is now a creative writing major at the University of Southern California. But a poetry slam is where students perform their original poetry. Now there's something called Poetry Alive that you can do as well, but Poetry Alive is a little bit different, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But Poetry Slam is original poetry. You need to come up with a set of rules about what your guidelines are for what they're writing. You can come up with a theme if you want or not. I usually enlisted a number of English teachers. I would love to have had all of my English teachers participate, but what we did was first round happened in English classrooms on the Monday of the week of the Poetry Slam. The students themselves voted on their top picks, and then the semifinalists moved forward from their classroom to the library on Wednesday of Poetry Slam week, where I had judges who came in and judged the poems all day on Wednesday. And then the top 20 scoring poems went to the finals on Friday. We held it in the auditorium, invited the school, had outside judges who came in. I did develop a rubric for this. And each year we had those 20 students who would perform, and the students would practice their Poetry Slam etiquette, which would, instead of clapping, they would snap. And I'm a terrible snapper, so that didn't sound very good. But you teach them to snap instead of clap. And it was a celebration of creativity. And these students are really interesting because these are not always the jocks. These are not always the clique kids. These are kids who really are creative, and sometimes they have a lot to say. Poetry everywhere. You can do lots of different things. You can do a poem in your pocket day. This is where teachers and students carry around a poem in their pockets, and if they get asked in the hallway, then they'll read their poem aloud. You can do bulletin boards that feature poems. You can do listening centers with poets reading their poems in your library. You could have poems read on the daily announcements or their school TV show. Poetry Alive, I mentioned earlier, is a little bit different, And Poetry Alive is a competition where students perform poems, 2 poems, and these are not original poems. So you could do a Poetry Alive competition as well. And the poems are classic poems. A couple of other poetry activities: you could do themed displays with books of poetry about different times of history, about civil rights, about Women's History Month, about Earth Day. You could also, when you create classroom sets or bundles of resources that are centered around Common Core objectives, you could include poetry books within those. You could also work with writing poetry in the library. There are lots of different types of poetry that you could use. One great resource I have listed here is an article that was in School Library Monthly about a year ago about writing poetry in the school library. You can do acrostic poems, persona poems, concrete poems. I've used bio poems, where you have very scripted poems where you tell them exactly what content to include. Another great resource for getting ideas for programming is to go to the blog Poetry for Children by Professor Sylvia Vardell. She has lots of ideas for activities about using poetry and integrating poetry in the classroom and the library. She's written a number of books. Her most recent book is called the Poetry Friday Anthology for Middle School, and she's got poems around numerous themes and lots of ideas about how to work them into your program. So what are we going to do with all these ideas for programming? What I'd like for you to do is to choose one activity that I've either discussed here in this presentation or that you found through the article that's listed in this PowerPoint or from the blog, and choose one activity that you want to move forward with to plan for National Poetry Month. I want you to post your idea in the discussion board forum that's called Poetry Programming, and then respond to your peers' ideas with further suggestions. So this concludes our discussion about poetry in the Young Adult Library and programming. I hope you have some ideas. Consult those websites in the blog, and I look forward to seeing your posts in the discussion board forum about poetry. I'll see you next time. Thanks.